Hello. Oops, is that not working?
Hello, everyone, and welcome, or welcome back, as the case may be, for our second presentation with Jim Hansen. Jim Hansen is a former NASA historian and author who spent more than 50 hours interviewing history's most famous space traveler, Neil Armstrong. And he is joined now by Adler's Vice President for Astronomy and Collections, Andrew Johnston. And these two know a lot about space history and space exploration. And so they're going to chat for a bit. And after maybe about 20 minutes, then we'll open it up to questions from you. So thank you for joining us. We're excited to hear from you.
All right, thanks, Lynette, and hello everybody to you this evening. Thank you for being here tonight. Thanks for being members, and thanks for your support. If you've been here all evening, you know we've been we've been helping to explore the moon. Here's a great view of the moon right there. Just a couple hours ago in this very space, Jim was here giving us a great view of what it was like to transition from the book to the movie that has really gotten a lot of attention. As Lynette was saying, and in fact, she mentioned before we came up here, Neil Armstrong, if you had to pick the one person to be the most famous space traveler, it would have to be Neil Armstrong. Before we get to talking about that specifically, I just wanted to ask you, just in general, to reflect a little bit about the meaning of lunar exploration that was going on in the 1960s. I mean, if you were to again, point to some of the peaks of human exploration. I mean, it's tough to beat getting humans to the moon during that very brief period of time. And that still holds some magic today, doesn't it? I mean, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary, but what are some of your thoughts now, reflecting back on that, for why it's still such an important thing? Even 50 years have gone by, and the whole context of that period is completely different, right? The Cold War is gone, the whole way that we do space exploration has completely changed, but it still has some resonance, doesn't it? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that it does, and I think one reflection of it, and maybe in some ways kind of an unfortunate reflection, but if any of you have been following some of the news coverage and reviews of our movie First Man, you know that it's provoked some different types of thoughts, where some have thought that it's, the fact that they were very concerned that the flag planting wasn't specifically shown in the movie, and somehow a suggestion from people who hadn't seen the movie that that must mean that it's not a patriotic movie. Then there were some reviews, and maybe I'm learning one thing now that I'm involved with, but I should have learned it as a book author, is that maybe I shouldn't read so many reviews. That's maybe not a safe thing to be doing. But we've had some reviews. There was a review in the New Yorker, in fact, that suggested that the movie, not that it had some liberal globalist agenda, which was what the people with the concerned about the flag were talking about, but that somehow it was unintentionally some sort of delusional, retrograde, right-wing message in the movie.
So yeah, you did both at once.
Yeah, so it's been attacked on both sides, and the only good thing I can think about that is that art has been over the centuries has often been alienated just about everyone in some respects. And also the fact that the lunar landing means so much still to people that it really has, there's a lot of emotion that comes with it, a lot of investment with it. So that's just connecting it to what I'm seeing in terms of the reaction to the film. In terms of the larger question about the 60s, I think one thing that 75 or 80% of the world's population that wasn't alive back then, would not have, understand as well, but even a lot of us who lived through it wouldn't, and that is how absolutely extraordinary President John F. Kennedy's commitment was to go to the moon in May of 1961. I mean, NASA and people thinking about aerospace and space, there were lunar missions of various kinds that were being considered, but they weren't thinking that it was going to happen that soon. I think if you go back into the 1950s and you look at some of the the visionaries of space exploration. What they saw was kind of an incremental step-by-step approach where you'd have probably some sort of you would move like from the X-15 program where you're developing a hypersonic glider and you're going to develop some kind of shuttle that's going to service a space station. You're going to develop Earth orbiting capabilities, and then from there you're going to move out and do your lunar exploration. You're not going to leapfrog over the Earth orbit side of it and go, and go directly to the moon. But that you have to understand that in the context of this very extraordinary set of circumstances that young President Kennedy found himself in just a few months after his inauguration, where you have the Russians getting Gagarin into orbit, seemingly beating us once again into a space first, and then also the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the failed overthrow of Castro, a CIA plan that Kennedy inherited from the Eisenhower administration, and that happened right in the same spring season of Kennedy's first for a few months. And those two things together, led Kennedy and his administration into the consideration of, well, what is it we need to do? It seems like the Russians have these big boosters, and what is it that we can do if we start now that we can beat them at? And the Kennedy administration was even thinking, well, maybe we needed to go to Mars. Maybe that's how big we needed to go. But they were reassured by the people in NASA that no, going to the moon would be plenty, big enough. And so lunar exploration was always part of the idea. The moon has been such an important. It's been there in the night sky in the day sky for us, from the beginning of our existence, and it's always had we've always had strong connections to the moon. So it was a natural place for us to consider exploration and movement and settlement. But the way that it happened was totally unpredictable. And that's what makes studying that history so interesting, because you have to explain all the different contingencies that came together to make that happen.
You do have to explain it, right? Jim and I were speaking earlier. I've been here at the Adler for about 2.5 years, and before that I was at the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian, which opened to the public in 1976 with the Apollo 11 command module on display. And at that time, you didn't really need to explain to people. The director of the museum was Michael Collins, Apollo 11 astronaut, and you didn't need to explain what the Cold War was because it was still on, right? But opportunities like the book and the movie, I think, are great opportunities for people to connect to that past. Do you think they're attracted to people reading the book and going to the movie? Do you think it's a more of an act of connecting with the past, or more of a potential future, or is in this case, in particular of this story, is it because they really want to understand the person that they're writing about, or is it a combination of all that?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of all that, and it's maybe a little bit too early for any of us to know what the impact's going to be. One would hope, as the author of the book and being involved with the movie, I'm hoping that it has some positive cultural, social impact and could be something that would inspire people to learn more about it. I hope that the movie's an experience that opens up a lot of issues and questions about that history, and I hope it means that people then will go to the books, that not just mine, but there's a pretty vast literature that deals with the early decades of the space program, not just in the United States, but around the world, certainly the Russian program. But I don't know, I guess I'm a little bit cynical about whether it will do that or not. I'm concerned. I was a college teacher I retired from university teaching at the end of spring semester 2017, and over the course of my 31 years of teaching, I saw just a slow but steady decline of our students' interest in reading. And they would, we would, and I think teachers, not everybody did it, but I felt almost necessary to sort of start to ratchet down how much reading I gave them on a weekly basis, because I wanted them to do the reading that I assigned to do it well. And if you assigned a couple hundred pages a week, they weren't going to do that well. And so I'm concerned, I would hope that people would go from a movie and then want to read the books. And I think, I think my generation and maybe a few earlier generations were more into reading, and we have some young people that love reading, but I think it's generally it's on some decline, and I'm kind of worried that people might go see the movie and that would be the end of their interest in it and not really learn much more. Maybe hopefully I'm wrong.
Yeah, I hope so too. We found, at least in our space museum business that we're in, that these kinds of informal engagement opportunities where people have an immersive experience, whether it's in a planetarium show or in a Hollywood movie, can attract people that then leads them to think about how they can delve into it deeper. Connecting back to the story that we're talking about tonight a little bit, I mean, you spent a lot of time talking with Neil Armstrong and then some of his other astronaut colleagues who, these were people that were not scared to read a lot. I mean, these were, and you also address in the book a little bit about whether or not Armstrong was always imagining the moon, and you also, some stories got inflated or even invented in the previous, but this was a group of special people, of course. They were chosen to be astronauts, but they really were experts in their field. They weren't just, fighter jocks. I mean, they really were thinking this. Would you agree that that was one of the things they all had in common?
Yeah, well, and certainly with the second group of astronauts, the so-called New Nine that Neil was a part of, and Jim Lovell was a part of, and John Young, and Frank Borman, and Ed White, and Elliot See. NASA had stepped up the engineering qualifications for astronaut selection, and so even more so than the original Mercury 7, the New Nine, the second group, and the later groups. Of course, they expanded. They later came. It wasn't much later, but later they started to get interested in having, science-educated astronauts. Someone like Harrison Schmitt, who was put on the Apollo 17 mission. He was a geologist. It wasn't so nice for Joe Engle, who was going to be on that flight until NASA made the decision. No, it's going to be our last Apollo mission. We need to get a geologist up there. I think that's one of the misconceptions about astronauts that some people might have, is that they were just really, there to fly the spacecraft. They were engineers that were, that were part of the development of the systems, and Neil, for example, Neil was a test pilot a civilian test pilot for the NACA and then NASA out at Edwards, and he was involved in the very early conception of the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, which becomes the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, which in the film, in one of my slides tonight, was the vehicle that the astronauts trained on to best simulate what it was like to fly the lander down to a lunar landing. It was a very dangerous machine to fly. Almost killed Neil, and it came close to killing a couple of others. But the thing about Neil was still a test pilot at Edwards when that very concept, when they took on the challenge. Well, how can we build a simulator that's going to be full scale, and you're going to fly it? It's going to fly in the Earth's atmosphere, but it's going to fly like it's in, at 1G, at 1/6 gravity. It's going to be like flying on the moon. And so that was the problem that the engineers, and Neil was one of them, who conceptualized what the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle would be. And then as he enters the astronaut corps and this thing becomes a trainer, not just a research vehicle, then he's actually flying it along with some of the others that are going to do the landings to actually fly this thing. And Neil would make comments on, he wrote actually a little booklet called Wingless on Luna, and it sort of narrates the whole history of the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle and the LLTV. And Neil would make the comment that that flying the LLTV was a lot harder to fly than the lunar module was. And it was really great when, think about it. When they detached from Columbia in lunar orbit, Buzz and Neil, they've never flown that thing before. You know, there's no opportunity to fly. I mean, they had flown it on Apollo 9 in Earth orbit and Apollo 10 in lunar orbit, so the machine had been tested in that sense. But Neil and Buzz had never been in that environment before, so it was really important to have a trainer that, you know, a simulator that gave them a, you know, pretty credible, realistic representation. And the fact that it was harder to fly the trainer than it was actually to fly the real thing, that was a great relief once they were in it.
He, flying the LEM, as related in your book, those of you, I assume a lot of people remember the story. There were limited amount of fuel left and so forth. And the way that Neil tells the story is like, oh, well, you get to within 50 feet altitude or so forth, even if you run out of fuel, with 1/6 gravity, you'll just coast down. I wasn't that worried. Was he that cool of a cucumber?
Well, that's kind of how he told the story. I mean, I think he felt like once he got down to a certain altitude above the lunar surface, he was confident that, you know, he kind of described it maybe a little bit in a more confident way than we would, for sure. But he was talking, he compared it to, like, you know, your gasoline tank and the curvature at the bottom of your tank or whatever, that even when it's showing it's empty, there's a little bit left.
I still got 10 miles. I'm only halfway through the E.
Right. And so he was just really confident that by the time that it got down to 2% of the fuel supply left, that he was in a position where he was going to be able to get it down. And so he acts, you know, in the interviews, he, you know, never seemed to be too worried about that, or worried about those program alarms that came on the way down either, which were basically where the onboard computer was overloaded with data and was having a hard time catching up and processing it. And you know, Neil and Buzz didn't know what 1201 or 1202 or 1204 meant, but the guys in Houston did, and they were able to pretty quickly let them know. So for Neil said those alarms that happened as they were coming down, that he was never really terribly, well, what they were distractions. Yeah. You know, he didn't need to be distracted from what he was really, and to have those going off and having to take care of them, you know, was a bother, but it wasn't anything that scared him in terms of, you know. But there was always, I mean, he was very aware that aborts were possible. I mean, you know, before the mission, I think he told people that, you know, it could be 50-50 whether they would really land or not. And he didn't mean 50-50 they'd land or they would die. It was just, you know, they might have to abort. There's a lot of mission rules that say in this situation, you know, you're going to need to abort. But Neil knew that once you get to a certain, you know, a certain place in your descent, aborts weren't automatic. It's safer to go on down than it is to really, you know, fire the ascent engine and go back up. And so they didn't want to abort, not just because they wanted to make sure they landed, but they knew there were dangers in the abort maneuvers.
So let's talk a little bit about how you worked with Neil in this process. I mean, we were talking earlier, and you mentioned just a couple hours ago, you were not the first person to contact Neil Armstrong to write a biography, and it took a while for him to sign up. But why do you think he was comfortable working with you?
Well, you know, it took, as I said earlier, it took about 2 years for me to, from the time I first contacted him before he gave me the green light. And once he did, I wasn't about to ask him, well, why have you decided to do that? I wasn't going to go there. You know, no, as long as he was saying yes, that was good enough for me. So I've really only been able to kind of speculate on my own part, and his sons, Mark and Rick, I mean, they were aware of these discussions and what was going on, and so they've shared some of the things that they think their dad had in mind. I think mainly it was, I was about 20 years into my career at that point, and I had written a lot of books that dealt with aerospace technology. I mean, I'm not an engineer, I've never had an engineering course in my life, but when I graduated with my PhD from Ohio State in 1981 in the history of science and technology, NASA hired me to write a book for them, and I really had to learn, because I was writing about Langley Research Center in Virginia, which is one of the oldest, is the oldest NASA laboratory. It actually goes back before NASA, and it was an aeronautical research laboratory, wind tunnels and structures and flight testing and things. And so I really had to learn what engineering was all about, and most of the interviews I did with people they were engineers. And so I had to bring a blackboard into my office because the engineers had to write equations on the board. And I had, so I had the disadvantage that I was writing about history of engineering without being an engineer, but I tried to turn that into an advantage because most people, if you're not engineers, you have to explain things verbally. If you're trying to explain Bernoulli's equation, which is a basic equation involving aerodynamic lift, an engineer will just say, well, here's the equation. It doesn't get any simpler than that. Okay? Right? There it is. It's right there.
It's easy.
Well, for those of us that are mathematically illiterate or something, close to that, I hit a wall of differential equations in my own math education. And so what I felt I had to do was, okay, how can I best explain to people that are not engineers and not mathematically oriented, what does Bernoulli's equation mean? What do the symbols mean? And so I took what I thought was a disadvantage and turned it into an advantage. So I could, in my writing, I could explain it to people. I could explain it to myself.
It became a tool.
It became a tool. And so I've been doing this for like 20 years, translating engineering, and engineering culture, engineering organizations, engineering methodology to more general readers. And I think, and Neil I made sure that I gifted him copies of my earlier books, and I know that he took a look at some of them, and I think Neil saw that I would take his technical side seriously. And first and foremost, Neil was an engineer. He was a Purdue graduate in aeronautical engineering. He had gone to school wanting to become an aircraft designer, and he didn't see the sense in having someone write his life story that was just going to sensationalize it or just write about the moon landing. He had been a naval aviator. He'd flown 78 combat missions in Korea. He had been a test pilot. He'd flown, dozens of different experimental flying machines. And he could tell from my work that I would take that side of him seriously. So I think that was really critical. The fact I was an academic, I think that's something to Neil, because he took his own education seriously.
And his teaching later too.
And his teaching. What did he do when he left NASA after they wouldn't let him fly into space anymore? He chose to move to Cincinnati and teach at the university, teach aerospace engineering. So he had this academic side to him. And then I think there was a personal chemistry thing. I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He grew up in Wapakoneta, Ohio. Those two places are about 55 miles apart. And we both had kind of the same Midwestern accent. We both came from farming families. When I met him, he invited me to his home, and I spent the afternoon with him. We just kind of got along, and by that time I had 20 years of writing. Many of the people and things I had written about had connected to his career earlier in some pretty direct ways. In fact, I kind of felt, this is I think a really illuminating anecdote. One of the people that I'd gotten to know quite well at NASA Langley Research Center was a test pilot by the name of Jack Reeder, John P. Reeder. And not a household name unless you're really into the history of flight. But Jack was a brilliant engineering research test pilot, one of the best NASA ever had. And I got to know Jack quite well, and he taught me a lot about what it meant to be what the real right stuff was, not the right stuff that we saw in the movie, but the real right stuff. And so, my conversation with Neil, the first time I visited him at his home, I wasn't really trying to drop names or anything, but somehow the conversation turned, and I said, that I'd gotten to know Jack Reeder, and I really, learned a lot from Jack. And as soon as I mentioned Jack Reeder, Neil turns to his wife Carol, who was in the room with us at the time, and he said to her, "Jack Reeder was the best test pilot I ever knew." And then he turned back to me and he said, "And Chuck Yeager was the worst." Now, people remember that. I mean, you're laughing at the second part, which is, I guess, the most memorable part. But the really meaningful part for me was what he said about Jack Reeder, because Neil knew from what I had just said that I had not just a regard, but I had an understanding of why a pilot like Jack Reeder was so important to study, and what he represented and what he embodied. Neil knew that that was the type of test pilot that really counted. And so the fact that I had mentioned somebody just casually, I had no idea that he even knew Jack Reeder, but I had mentioned somebody that he thought was the best test pilot that he ever knew. And I think at that point I thought, this might work out. This might work out.
You mentioned the focus that he always had on engineering. I just want to ask a little bit about the personality of both Neil and these other lunar explorers. And of course you cover this extensively in the book, but Neil had a reputation for being a bit more reticent. One could contrast him with some of his fellow travelers and so forth. And some of that is maybe his personality. Some of it was, if you're the most famous man in the world, how do you keep sane, right? But could you expand on that a little bit? I mean, was he really? Did he prefer to stay away from the crowds, or was this just something that became his way of life as the first man?
Yeah, my own sense of him was that the moon landing really didn't change him in any fundamental ways, but it did exacerbate or reinforce some personality traits that were already there. Because, for many months after Apollo 11, and I know this because Neil's papers are now in the archives at Purdue University, where he went to school. My papers for the book are there too. And I've looked through almost everything, I did for the book. I didn't actually get, for my book research, I didn't even get into all of his papers because some of them I just didn't have access to. But now they're all at Purdue, and what I didn't see I've looked at. And for several months after Apollo 11, Neil was getting 10,000 fan mail letters a day. 10,000 a day. And NASA tried to give him some help to answer them, and of course, he got way behind in answering a lot of these things. And all of those letters, but this is kind of, as a historian, archivist interest, this really is disturbing. But a lot of the fan mail that went into the astronaut office in Houston, after a certain number of years, they just got rid of it all. They destroyed it. So all these really interesting letters written from people all over the world, all kinds of letters from kids. At Purdue, there's about 90,000 letters preserved that Neil himself had preserved. And I've looked at virtually every one of them to see what they're about, and some of them I've read. And I'm actually working with Purdue University Press to do a 2-volume book series on his correspondence. Back to the issue of Neil's personality, again, I think the reticence, the introspective aspect, everything about Neil Armstrong that you're going to see later, I think you see earlier. And as a biographer, and as a human being, I guess, I hope you agree with me. I think it's just commonsensical. There's someone said, I forget who first said this, but the child is the father to the man. I strongly believe that any really good biography is going to spend quite a bit of time with childhood development, family, background, and I think to really understand Neil's personality as an adult, you need to understand his personality development as a child, and that involves his relationships with his mother and his father, relationships with his siblings. Of course, that's something that the movie doesn't do anything with at all. The movie covers from 1961 to 69 and doesn't introduce any of those other characters. So things that are fundamentally important to me as a biographer, and I think absolutely essential to understanding who Armstrong becomes, movie doesn't touch that stuff, but my book does, and I think, and I talked also to some professors at my university, and I did some additional reading as well on childhood development and personality development to sort of see someone that develops characteristics like Neil did. Just want to give you one example. Neil didn't argue with people. I remember in my interview with Gene Kranz, the famous flight director of Mission Control at Harris Place and then Apollo 13, and Gene told me a lot of interesting things about Neil, but one of which was Neil didn't argue. Neil, it may be that Neil didn't agree with you, but he didn't argue with you. And so he said there was what he was thinking. And when they were going over mission rules for Apollo 11, Gene said, we really had a lot of confidence in Armstrong, but at the same time, he didn't verbalize or vocalize specific, if he objected to something or disagreed with something when it came to a mission rule, he didn't speak out about it. So you couldn't be sure whether he really agreed with that mission rule or not. And so, but when I heard that story from Gene Kranz, Neil didn't argue. And I heard it from Mike Collins, and I heard it from Buzz Aldrin, and I heard it from other Apollo astronauts. What I went back to was things that I had learned about Neil as a child. Neil's mother, Viola, was a really crucial figure. I think more so than the father, she was really the crucial parent in Neil's development. She was a very strongly religious woman. She was an evangelical Christian, and she didn't talk about her, she didn't force her views on her family in terribly direct ways, but all the kids were expected to go to church and read the Bible with her and different things. Well, Neil doesn't turn out to be a strong evangelical Christian. In fact, he himself would describe himself later as a deist, who's someone who's not really doctrinal in any religious orientation, someone who believes in God, the cosmic clockmaker, kind of coming out of the Enlightenment, out of science, makes the natural laws by which the world divides, and then just sort of steps back and you sort of study God by studying the creation. That was the kind of religious sense that Neil had. He didn't believe really in a personal savior type of religion. His mother did. And by talking to Neil's sister and brother in particular, but talking to Neil, getting Neil to say some things about this, when Neil's mother talked about religion, or religion was brought up in the family as it was on a regular basis, Neil would listen politely to his mother, not say anything, and walk away. He would not argue. He would not. I think about myself, and I go back to my child. I was arguing with everybody about everything. If I didn't agree with it, I was testing my ideas out on everyone. Neil didn't do that. Neil just he sort of had his own world of thoughts, and he was happy enough keeping them to himself for the most part. And that happened I think within a family setting where, somehow, some way he decided it was a good idea to sort of keep that world to himself and keep certain ideas to himself. And he did that over and over again for the rest of his life. So that's why I say, as a biographer, it upsets me when I have editors of my book saying, well, we need to make these first chapters of the book shorter, because we want to get to the good stuff later on. Well, if you don't really understand the development of the child, you're not going to understand the adult. And so that's why I think, you really need to understand as much as you can what's going on inside the family and what's going on with those relationships with the parents and the siblings.
So your interaction with the editor is a good segue, because I want to finish up the questions I have for you. Just actually, let's talk about the movie and your work on the movie. Those of us that do things like make exhibits and write books, we know that sometimes it's about fact checking, but of course that's not the most interesting thing that we do, right? It's about finding stories that are compelling based on things that really happen, but that can be inspiring. You mentioned a couple hours ago here that you were mostly happy with you were able to fight for issues of accuracy in the movie and so forth. So, but just in general, before we get into any specifics about the movie, how did you see your role as the movie was being produced? You're the professional historian in the room. Were you there just to check facts, or were you also looking after the storyline that you thought could be useful in the movie?
Yeah. I wish a couple of the producers from the film were actually up on stage with us too, so they could address this particular issue. Because I think they had a different idea of this than I did. I wasn't sure. This was my first time in this setting, and I think honestly, when I was first invited, of course I reviewed every version of the script, and maybe even just this alone will answer your question. I get from Josh Singer, who's the screenwriter, who is just coming off winning the Academy Award for the movie Spotlight. If you saw that movie about the Boston Globe and its coverage of the child abuse scandal within the Catholic Church, that won Best Film. He won Best Screenplay. So he's coming off winning an Oscar. Well, he's screenwriting for Damien Chazelle and First Man, and I get, and Josh he contacted me. He read my book. We met at the Smithsonian. I introduced him to a lot of people at the museum and over at NASA History Office. So we were getting along fine. Josh sends me his preliminary outline, which is about 100 pages. It's not really quite a script yet. It's more of a treatment of how things are going to be done. And Josh asked me, for my comments. I sent him back 70 single-spaced pages of comments. He would not speak to me for the next 3 months. I got a call from one of the producers in Los Angeles saying, "Jim, what are you doing? We wouldn't dare give our screenwriters those sorts of comments." And I thought the comments were all constructive. I wasn't like sniping at him. I just thought it was my job to give him everything I had, right? If it was something I thought could help, I thought I should write it. Well, I think in retrospect, I probably ended up giving Josh 5 times that many comments over the course of the next year or two. But they didn't need to come in that form when they did. I think he was struggling, he was working to try to fulfill Damien Chazelle's vision for the movie, and so he was moving in that direction, and he didn't need to be nitpicked by the author of the book at that point in time the way that I apparently was doing. And so I did step back some, but then he would tell me certain things, and I don't feel like I'm talking. Josh knows that I've talked about this, and he knows that it's the honest truth. There would be things in the screenplays that I would see, dialogue, where they would have Neil saying something that I thought, well, Neil would never say that, or he wouldn't say it that way. And mostly it was always with the character of Neil, because I felt like I knew him the best. Others, I was maybe less sure about. But so when I would see dialogue that I didn't think worked or was correct, I would say, well, he would say something more like this, and then I would give, what I thought would be a better line of dialogue. Well, Josh wrote me back and said, "Jim, quit sending me dialogue. I'm not going to look at any of your dialogue. I don't want dialogue from you." And I thought, well, if I just tell you the dialogue's wrong and I don't give you any help on how to fix it, then what am I really doing? If you're this, my opinion privately was, if you're that wrong on this piece of dialogue, unless I tell you what I have in mind, you're going to continue to get it really wrong.
Comments like a good academic, right?
Yeah. I was used to doing this to doctoral dissertations, for my whole career. 70 pages, and maybe that was a little bit more than I would normally do. But that sort of tells you where I was. I felt such a strong responsibility to Armstrong and to the history that I thought it was my job to let them know everything, give them everything I have. Right. And then, the agreement that we came to eventually was, okay, if that's the way you're going to do it, Jim, give us everything you have. Just realize we're not going to use it all, and I needed to be able to live with that. Right. I'd do my best to point it out, and if they, and like I said, my batting average was about 400. Not bad,
So my last question before we turn it out to the audience is, we actually did talk about something specific in the movie that you said you had some thoughts of. I'm not going to give away any spoilers, but there is something that Neil does on the moon that's an essential part of the script as written. One of the things I liked about it is that they didn't invent that out of whole cloth, and because it did actually take it from your book, not the specific incidents, but how are you comfortable? How comfortable are you with a script going in a place that's sort of hypothetical and making up events that could make it a more emotional storyline, but it is something that didn't quite happen that way.
Well, this is hard to talk about without being
Yeah,
specific.
actually, can we? Are people scared of movie spoilers?
Well,
No. All right, have at it. Go ahead.
Is it the daughter part?
well, you go ahead and describe it, and then I'll report.
Okay, so there is earlier on in. Well, actually, I don't need to. I'll just get to the end point there. That in the movie, Neil actually leaves a memento on the surface of the moon that is from his daughter Karen, who had died many years before.
Yeah. Well, in my book, at the end of the chapter dealing with them being on the surface of the moon, I do have a couple pretty solid paragraphs that deal with the issue of whether Neil left. What did he take of a personal nature, and might have he taken something that was in memory of his daughter who died of brain cancer back in early 1962. There's a chapter in the book called The Worst Loss, which is all about the death of the child. And this was no one that had dealt with Armstrong's life prior to my biography had really ever, had not even known that he had a daughter, because he kept it so private. He and Janet didn't talk about it. I mean, that's in the movie, and that's true. Neil didn't talk about it with Janet, which was, a lot of marriages don't survive the loss of a child. That one did, and kind of surprising in some respects. And so when I got to the issue of whether he brought, see, the astronauts had personal property kits, PPKs, where they could bring things, personal items, jewelry pieces, or whatever they wanted for family members and whatever. And no one's seen Armstrong's, the manifest for his PPK, so we don't really know for sure what he took. And so in my book, I speculate, what did he take? What might have he taken? And I talked to Neil, and I talked to Neil's sister, is it possible that he took something for Karen? And if so, it would have been something immensely private for him, and being the private man that he was. And so the movie takes off from my speculation and makes that into something that does happen on the lunar surface. And I had mixed feelings about it at the time. I do now. I actually suggested to the filmmakers, since there's no, I think the proof, the real fact is, there's no evidence that he did this, but there is no absolute proof that he did not. So we really don't know for sure. But the movie depicts it as if it's happened. I suggested to them that they make it kind of a fantasy scene, where we're not sure whether he's imagining this or it's really happening or not. Yeah, and they listened to me, but they obviously didn't take. It's really powerfully done in the film. I mean, it's really powerful. And I came up with this I've been interviewed about this quite a bit, and I come up with a statement. I don't know if it's enough where I can just quote it and stop, but what I came up with is, sometimes there is a poetry that prevails over the uncertainty of fact. Sometimes there is a poetry that prevails over an uncertainty of fact. And I think in our lives and our culture, that's true. It's true in a lot of ways in terms of what we believe in or have faith in or want to believe in. So I think people who knew Neil, including his children and his sister and others, want to think that Neil did do something. Yeah, Neil's sister actually told me in an interview when I asked her, the quote is, "Oh, I dearly hope so." His sister, who knew Neil in some ways better than I think anybody, even his wives, his sister really knew Neil and could explain Neil. That's why the sister was so crucial to the book. And so I guess I can leave it at that. I mean, people will feel different things about it. I do believe, and I've spent 20 years, I've done some other things besides Neil Armstrong work, that I've been thinking about Neil, so much so that my family, back when I was doing the book, my wife had a rule that I could only talk about Neil once per meal. But she didn't give me a time limit. So that was her mistake. But no one's thought more about him, than maybe family members over the past 20 years or so. But if I ever traveled to that place, Tranquility,
Which is
and I went over to Little West Crater, I would be headed over there to take a look to see, because here's another thing that is fact. Neil did go over to the crater. It was not scripted. I mean, and I'm not talking about the movie. It was not in the NASA mission plan for him to go over there. When he went over there, he had to run over there as best as he could. In fact, when he got there, we have this from the telemetry, his heart rate went up to 180. There's in fact a cardiologist named William Rowe. You can Google this. William Rowe, cardiologist, Neil Armstrong syndrome. He believes that Neil had some sort of major cardiac event at that crater, and he believes he has, and he's been published in medical journals about this. So we know Neil went over there. He was not on TV camera. Buzz was already heading back into the LEM. Mission Control was telling Neil, get yourself back. You got to get yourself back into the LEM yourself. We don't know exactly what he did over there. So if he did do something, we don't know what exactly that he did. And when I asked him, and I waited until the very last interview I did with him, because I didn't want to spook him with a question about his dead daughter and a break and any kind of memento until I really had the book pretty much. The book had to be done. But when I asked him, Neil's answer, I remember this very, very clearly. He looked down at the floor and he said to me, I took nothing for myself. Well, there were some things that he took for himself. He took, part of the right flyer cloth. You could say that was for himself or for somebody, but it wasn't a direct answer to my question about taking something for his children and for his daughter in particular. So to me, it's kind of an open question. To me, it's not a complete fraud to have done this in the movie. It is a legitimate, open question about what he did.
Great. All right. Well, we are running a little bit long, but let's. I think we got time for a couple of questions. So, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and Lynette is going to come and grab the microphone out of my hand and give it to you.
Okay, we'll start right here in the front row.
Thank you. Do you know how Neil and Buzz and Mike feel about your book? What their thoughts are?
Well, Neil, of course, passed away in 2012. Mike and Buzz are still alive. But I know better what Neil thought of the book than the other two, because Neil told me when we were finished, my last meeting with him when we were going over the book, so I didn't want him, he looked at every manuscript page. It wasn't to try to control my content, it was just, I wanted him to look at it to make it as accurate as I could. And so it was the last meeting with the book finished up before going to the publisher. And Neil, we stood up, he shook my hand, I was heading to my hotel, and Neil said, Jim, you wrote exactly the book you told me you were going to write. That doesn't sound like much of a compliment unless you really understand Neil Armstrong. Here's a guy that, that people, ever since, he became first man after Apollo 11, had been trying to get him to do all sorts of things that he didn't want to do, and not always truthful about it. They'd say one thing and try to get him to do another. And so for him to congratulate me for writing the book I told him I was going to write, that was a statement of the honesty in my approach that was the biggest compliment I could have gotten. Buzz, I know this about Buzz. Buzz didn't like the title of the book.
No, that's for sure.
And that's understandable. But Buzz didn't understand, I hope he does now, is I chose the title First Man not just because of Neil being the first onto the lunar surface. If that was all there was to it, then it would be maybe an unfair, title. Buzz and Neil both do land at the very same instant. In a sense, they both get on the moon at the same time. But what I don't think Buzz appreciated, but maybe now does, is that the book is not just a biography, it's an iconography. It's a study of Armstrong as an icon. And he does become an icon as first man that has much more significance to it, because the world projected all this significance onto him. They gave Neil meanings, they projected meanings onto him, told stories about him that were wildly exaggerated and sometimes totally made up. And my book the last chapters of the book, I think, are some of the most interesting chapters, because I explore the iconography. I explore what people in culture was trying, just to give you one example. After the moon landing, there was a persistent rumor developed, and it's still there. Go on Google it and see how many hits you get. There was a story that was circulating in the Islamic world that Neil heard the Muslim call to prayer on the lunar surface and had converted to Islam after the moon landing, and that the reason that he seemed to be leading a reclusive life and not going out in public is that the American government had essentially, they didn't want the world to know that he had converted to Islam, and they were making sure that he didn't talk about it, but that he was living in Lebanon. Well, he was living in Lebanon, Ohio, which is a suburb north of Cincinnati. And I'm always a little reluctant to tell this story, but I mean, it's an example of how world religion wants to make the moon landing narrative part of its own story. And I'm always a little worried about telling this story as if somehow I'm trying to ridicule Islam, which I'm not. Every world religion. I mean, one thing I've done is I looked at the moon landing was on a Sunday. And I've looked at all of at sermons that were preached in Christian churches, on the day of the moon landing, and how Christianity interpreted the moon landing and Neil Armstrong himself, as in a messianic kind of way. And so all of the great world religions have, in one way or another, tried to embrace the moon landing because it was such an epic story in the history of humankind. So that's why I called the book First Man, because it got to the iconic elements of the story, not just the life elements. And Buzz just never quite I don't think he really understood it that way. Mike, I don't really know what Mike has thought about it. I've had many conversations with him since, and they've all been friendly, and he obviously doesn't have the problem with, the same kind of problem Buzz has had with the title. I think Mike, I wish that the movie, it wouldn't be the same movie, but I wish that, that Mike is such a great guy, such a funny guy, such a charming guy, intelligent guy. I wish there had been a way, with both Buzz and with Mike, that their roles in the movie would have been beefier than they are.
One more question, and then they're going to keep us
The
out.
answers are just too long.
Well, like I said, your wife didn't give you time. No.
Speaking of Buzz Aldrin, do you think Buzz was treated unfairly in the screenplay and in the movie?
Good question, David. Yes and no. I mean, all of the lines that are there are things that either Buzz said or has written about and are characteristically Buzz. But there are other elements of Buzz, certainly his performance as an astronaut, his performance as the lunar module pilot. There were other scenes that were filmed that have Buzz in them, that show Buzz in different ways, that did not make the movie. And I think that's unfortunate, because it would have given a more balance. Because whenever Buzz shows up in the film, he's kind of a know-it-all. He's speaking out of turn. He's saying something that shows. But I will say this on the other side, defending it. When I interviewed Collins for the book, and Mike was one of my very best interviews, just so insightful. One of the things that he said to me about Buzz, he said, it's not that Buzz doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, because he does. He just doesn't know appropriate from inappropriate. And that's Collins. I'm not making that up. That's Collins. And when it comes to the relationship between Neil and Buzz, again, Mike had, always give Mike the first and the last word. Mike called the Apollo 11 crew amiable strangers. and that doesn't apply to any other Apollo crew. It just doesn't. Amiable strangers. That they were friendly enough, but they didn't really become bosom buddies. They didn't go out drinking beer together. They just kind of went their separate ways. So I knew that he had used this phrase "amiable strangers" in a book that he had written, a very good book. And so I asked Mike. I said, "Well, if the crew was amiable strangers, what would you describe Buzz and Neil, just their relationship?" And Mike thought for a second. He said, "Well, neutral strangers." And I think that's a perfectly apt kind of, again, I think they worked well together. They performed their jobs extremely well, but there was I don't think there was ever really any kind of strong personal bond between them. And the movie certainly doesn't show that. But I think it's a fair question, David. I do think, I wish those other scenes hadn't been cut out. I'm hoping someday we get the director's cut that's about 4 hours long.
No, not the director. We want the historian's cut, which will be 5 hours long.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, let me sum up with a couple things to welcome you back soon, because as you know, here at the Adler we keep doing fun things. On December 1st, which is a Saturday, we're going to have our Authors and Astronomers program, which is going to be here at the Adler, where we're actually going to have a series of 3 authors, correct, paired up with astronomers here at the Adler, talking about their books. It'll be a nice journey through your mind and through space. And then also in January, we're going to be premiering our new sky show. So we're having a new planetarium show. It's called Imagine the Moon, and it's all about that thing right there. It's all about the moon, but it's about how the moon has changed over the years, but how it's changed in here. How people have imagined the moon to be in the past, and how people imagined it as a place that we could go, and then of course people did go, and then how we imagine it today, and how we continue to learn from the things that Apollo astronauts did, so that we can learn about, for instance, where the moon came from. With that, I want to do a couple things. First, I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank all of you for your membership and for supporting the Adler. And then I'll finish up. Please join me in thanking Jim Hansen for this wonderful evening. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Please exit using the doors on my right or left. Thanks, everybody. Take care.